Yes.
Okay, great. Before I start, I want to introduce my partner in crime, Suzanne Nguyen. Suzanne is our Director of Planning and Construction, and she will be presenting a lot of the, or all of the maps and enrollment and some of the other information that makes up the bulk of the presentation. But I am going to start with some information about why are we rezoning. The last time the district did a comprehensive rezoning involving all of the schools was in 1983. Obviously, a lot has changed in the last 4 decades since we last did rezoning. Obviously, changes in population growth. We've had new development, migration within the county. Obviously, as most of you probably are aware, we've had a lot of people move from east to west. And then, of course, the expansion of choice options, not just magnet programs, but charters and vouchers. And of course, we've seen an additional change in the voucher system this year, which we anticipate will have an impact. So currently 20 of our 36 schools are overcrowded. And by that, we mean 90% beyond 90%, they're at 90% of capacity. We have 4,800 empty seats district-wide, and that includes our vacant schools, which includes what we call Old Terwilliger near the mall, Prairie View Elementary School in East Gainesville, which was used as a swing school when Idlewild was redone, and there are plans to use it as a swing school again, for example, for Williams Elementary School, and then Duval Elementary School, also in East Gainesville. So when you have a huge imbalance between very overcrowded schools in some cases and very under-enrolled schools in other cases, that means you're not using your facilities or your operating funds as effectively as you should be, and that means you've got less money available for teaching and learning. So we've had a question about, well, then why not just build more space? Either build a new school or add new buildings to add capacity, and we've done some of that. I mean, the bottom picture here shows that the new classroom building that was built over at Oakview Middle School, strictly to add capacity. And but the fact is that we've got a number of issues that are a number of challenges. New construction is incredibly expensive, and costs continue to go up. Obviously, COVID didn't help, supply chain issues, but even now with inflation, and it is just very, very expensive to build. And our facilities funding is limited, even with the half cent, which thank goodness we have the half cent. We do not have enough money to do everything we need to do to bring our facilities up to where they need to be. There are state limitations on new construction. When you're using, we have 2 primary sources of funding for facilities. One is the property tax, what we commonly call the 1.5 mils, that we are allowed to, or that is specifically intended for facilities. That pot of money is very limited by state rules and regulations. So you have to get permission to use that money to add capacity. And if you have capacity somewhere else in the district, doesn't matter how far it is from the kids who need the extra space, the state will not let you use that source of funding to build new schools. And right now, that is a majority of our facilities funding. We also have the half cent. We have more flexibility with that. Another thing to keep in mind is that even knocking down existing buildings, we have to get permission. And that's whether or not we plan to use half cent funding or 1.5 mil money to knock down and reconstruct or build new. There is a very lengthy process that you have to go through called the Castaldi process to get permission from the state to knock down a school building. And that's a process that can take 4 to 9 months and hundreds of pages of documentation that you have to provide to the state to get permission to knock down a school building. Simply adding classroom space puts an additional strain on core facilities. And core facilities means any facilities that pretty much all the students use. So that's the reason you have some schools that are serving kids lunch at 9:30, 9:45 in the morning, is because cafeterias are a core facility and there is not enough space. Media centers, music rooms, hallways are an issue. Even the area outside of school, parent drop off and pickup. Those areas are severely understrained when you have an overcrowded school, even if technically you have enough classroom space for all the students. And then some of our schools simply just don't have enough space or infrastructure to support new construction. So at this point, I want to turn things over to Suzanne to go through some information about our enrollment and our capacity. So Suzanne?
Hey, thank you, Jackie. Hello, everyone. I'm glad to be here tonight. I think Jackie should become the Director of Planning and Construction. You did a fabulous job presenting that information. So just to reiterate our goals and objectives, why are we making these changes? My goal in facilities is to create high quality learning experiences in all of our facilities. When I look at student success and supporting students, I look at it as a three-legged stool where we have our people, which are our staff and administrative and support staff, our parents, our community. The second leg I look at is our programs, and the third leg is our facilities. And I feel like this will at least address facilities potentially somewhat. The other two goals are reducing the overcrowding at the facilities that we have in the West and making efficient use of our facilities and funds, as Jackie mentioned previously. Our district primarily has overcrowding in the West, which I'm sure you're all aware of. And in the East is where we have our older schools and schools that are in need of modernization. So that's kind of the big picture of our district. The East is where we have our underutilized facilities as well. So what you see in front of you is our enrollment table for our permanent capacity buildings, not including portables. Portables are the things that we keep adding to sites that provide classroom space, but overtax our core facilities. So you can see things are kind of outlined in numerical order, where we have our percent utilization, the highest percent utilization at the top, and it continues to go down from there. Everything that's over 90% utilization is represented in red, and then yellow is 85 to 90%, and then anything below 85% is in green. So the other thing that's indicated on this chart are the magnet programs that are at those schools. The way that we calculate utilization is the enrollment divided by the actual school capacity, the permanent capacity. So if you see 141% at Newberry Elementary School, you know there's a lot of students in portables and core facilities that are overstretched. District-wide, we have 2,522 empty elementary school seats. That does include Prairie View, Duval, and Old Terwilliger campus. These numbers change daily with enrollment, as you know, but these numbers are representing the data we pulled from March 10th. 942 empty seats if the vacant schools are excluded. And there's no current plans to transition vacant sites back into traditional schools at this time. But I also think, as Jackie mentioned, we're in the process of some big things happening in the district. We're doing district-wide rezoning. We're also in the midst of beginning a strategic planning process, which I see those two things leading to the reevaluation of our capital improvement plan. So There's High Springs population includes elementary and middle school students. So in some cases, we have schools that have not the traditional, scenario where we have K through 5 and 6 through 8 and 9 through 12. Some of our schools are combination schools. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Is there any questions about this slide? I think it'd be easier to answer questions. Well, I'll let Megan make this decision. If you want to answer questions as we're on the slides, or do you want to wait till the end, Megan?
I think it might be better to wait until the end. Although if you have a question about a slide, you can put it in the chat and then we'll make sure we get to that.
Okay, great. All right. So we have the same information here about regarding our middle schools, Fort Clark, Kanapa, Ha, Oakview, all in the western part of the county, overcrowded. We have Oakview at 92%. That includes fifth grade. We just built a classroom addition that was shown in that was opened in December. These numbers include that new classroom building. And there's a strong desire to move fifth grade back to Newberry Elementary School without rezoning and or additional capacity. That doesn't have the ability to happen. We are limited with space at Newberry Elementary School. Just physically, we're limited with space and where we can put any more portables. So we have 1,355 empty middle school seats as of March 10th. And I've already mentioned that Oakview Middle includes 5th through 8th grades. Next slide, please. So this is also the same information. Again, you can see the trend of the Western schools. GHS is also at 94%. They do not have any portables on site. Buchholz, Newberry High School are bursting at the seams. We have 940 empty high school seats district-wide. The Hawthorne enrollment includes grades 6 through 12. They're a middle high. And the Lofton is a school of choice for students. So they don't have any, they're included in this chart, but they don't have any geographic attendance zones. Next slide. So we've also included the centers that Aquin Jones and Sidney Lanier, they do not have a geographic zone either assigned to them, but we wanted to include this information in our presentation, for your information. So they're at 56% utilization and 44% utilization. So the next series of maps shows the same information that I just showed you in chart format on maps, basically. So you can see what was highlighted in red on the map for the elementary schools, and then middle schools and the high schools. So our student, so we can go back to that previous slide, Jackie. Just one thing I want to mention real quickly. If you see the dot where Buchholz, there's a triangle there where Buchholz is located. Right in that vicinity for the past 6 years or so, I've been analyzing where the centroid of our student population is located, and it's lingering in that area right around Buchholz on the fringes of the city of Gainesville city limits, and it's continuing as we move forward in time. It's continuing to migrate towards the south and the west, which is where the majority of our development and student populations being generated. So
Suzanne, can you define centroid?
That's when you take all of the student addresses, that's kind of where the center of the student population lands.
Is this a mathematical geographic statistic or just an eyeball?
No, that's a geographic statistic, because I could show you in our next slide. We have all of our student population, their addresses mapped in our GIS system. So this map, every dot that you can't really see each individual dot, and we intentionally did that on purpose. We don't want to, have any students' information out there, but you can see, you know, as where the dots kind of congregate and get darker is where we have, you know, our student population. And the majority of our student population is in west of Buchholz. Well, half of our student population is west of Buchholz, but it's kind of, you know, moving and increasing towards the western part of our county, which is where all the development is happening. So the other part of this that I've included here are the enrollment and the number of students zoned as well in the chart.
Which basically, Suzanne, correct me if I'm wrong, that basically means that, so for example, there are actually 827 kids zoned for Idlewild. Of them, 514 are actually attending Idlewild. The others are going someplace else.
That's correct.
Magnet school, charter school, homeschool, private school, whatever.
That's correct. And that all that information we have captured as well. Where students are zoned, where they're attending, all that information has been captured. So we have the same information on the middle school student population, as well as the students attending high school. And so the other piece of information that's really critical to this rezoning process is gathering all the active development information. Active development is development that's currently being built or will be built in the next 3 years. And, you know, this is a map. That's something that we work with our interlocal agreement with the county and all of the cities. We get the development data from them. And we basically use student generation multipliers to figure out how many students will be generated from a given single family or multifamily development based on the number of units and the student generation multipliers. So as you can see on this map, so this is, again, this is a freeze frame of that period in time of the information we had back in March. I've gotten more information from, you know, since then, and we're currently continually updating this database to be able to use and account for these new incoming students in these areas where these developments are in the new zones that will be generated. So we don't wind up with a situation where we still continue to have overcrowded schools. We rezone and then we have our active development students start attending. So this is information that's in the GIS system that we're going to be, that student assignment is going to be using to develop the new school zones. So we have this information. You can see the development is happening, the western part of our county, Alachua, and it's starting to really become more and more active in High Springs as well. So we have this for middle. The dots of the development are not changing. The number of students will be changing depending on elementary, middle, and high school. And if you change, yeah, there's high school. So, and those are the numbers that we had back in March for those developments that were located in our current school zones, the number of students that would be generated with our active development coming in the next, as I mentioned, under construction now or in the next 3 years, up to 3 years. Jackie, do you want to cover this one, this slide? I can't hear you.
Okay, so as I'm sure most of you know, we've already had 5 community input sessions spread out throughout the district where people could come in person and give their input on rezoning. And I want to, you know, I tried to make it very clear to everybody who came that these were what I call our pre-map sessions. No maps have been drawn. We haven't drawn any boundary lines. or the staff has, because fortunately I don't have to be part of that particular process. So the goal of these meetings was just to share the same information you've seen this evening, sort of to set the stage, but otherwise to just get community input on comprehensive rezoning. So we've completed those sessions. We do have a website, and I'll show you the address in just a little bit. And you can actually see video from each one of those community input sessions because they were videotaped. What's coming up next is we actually have a meeting tomorrow. There is a school board workshop. There will actually be 2 topics covered during that workshop, rezoning and the district budget. That happens at 1 p.m. here at the district office. Then there is a plan for, right now the plan is for the staff that is going to be working on developing maps and zone lines to present their proposed revisions to the attendance zones on August 16th, 4 p.m. During a school board workshop. Then for the next 2 months, the plan is to have more community input sessions to share the proposed zones with the public and receive more input. September 19th is what's called the first reading of the proposed zone lines. Anytime you pass a new school board policy and the zone lines are actually part of school board policy, there is a state mandated process that you have to follow that includes 3 meetings. One is the first reading. Then after a certain amount of time has to pass before you hold a public hearing on the proposed zones. And then there's a certain amount of time that passes before you have a vote on the new policy, which in this case would be the revised attendance zones. And as you can see, that has to be held no less than 14 days from the public hearing. The plan is for the new attendance zones to take effect for the 24-25 school year. We are still obviously taking input. We do have more information. This presentation, videotapes of the previous meetings, videotapes or video of previous board workshops that were involved or that were at which rezoning was discussed. The actual policies that govern student assignment, a schedule of meetings, which we will continually update. Eventually, when we do have maps and zone lines to share, proposed maps and zone lines, that will go on this website as well. And we are also encouraging people who have input to share it at this email address, rezoning@gm.sbac.edu. The staff that is working on rezoning looks at everything that comes in through that address, and our board members also have access to that as well. So at this point, that's our presentation. So obviously we'd like to open it up to any questions that anyone has for either myself or for Suzanne. And I also appreciate Megan agreeing to videotape this meeting so that we have this input to share with the staff and with the board.
All right, so the way that this is going to work, we have some questions that were submitted in advance of the meeting, so we're going to start with those, and they may answer some of the questions that you're going to ask. And what we're going to do is, if you do have a question, either raise your hand, like I see Jenny and Mary have raised their hand, do it with the hand icon, or type it in the chat. If you already put a question in the chat, I already have it, I've recorded it, so we will get to that. So I'm going to start with the questions that were submitted in advance. The first one is about transportation. So obviously there are some issues with transportation, with late buses and such this year. Is that something that's going to be fixed before the rezoning, or will it just get worse?
We certainly hope it will get fixed. We are, obviously constantly hiring and training new drivers. We've raised the pay of drivers more than any other employee group in the last 5 years. Their pay has increased faster than any other employee group. But hiring drivers is a struggle all over the country. It is not unique to Alachua County Public Schools. It is a struggle everywhere. Transportation is one of the factors that the school board looks at, and that's built into school board policy. The student assignment policy includes transportation as one of the factors that the school board looks at in determining school attendance zones. The others are obviously access, walkability, access to the schools, and as Suzanne can tell you, that's something that we're also looking at the efficient use of our facilities, which we both talked about. I think there are 7 or 8 factors altogether, and transportation is certainly one of those that will be looked at. And certainly a goal will be to, have good walkability and reduce the need for buses. One of the things that we do here in Alachua County that is pretty unique is we provide transportation to our magnet programs. A lot of districts don't do that, but we are very generous with our transportation to magnet programs. And that pretty much doesn't matter where a kid lives and where they're going. So we've got kids that we're transporting from High Springs to East Side. And sometimes it's not a whole lot of kids on the bus. So that is something that the board has looked at and has talked about. Whether or not that will change, whether or not that's something that gets discussed as part of this process or as part of strategic planning, I have to think that's probably likely. But and one of the things that we are going to be asking the board for is to give us some direction on which of the criteria are most important to them, because quite frankly, some of the criteria conflict with each other. For example, if you're going for a plan that maximizes diversity, socioeconomic diversity, for example, and that is one of the factors, that can sometimes conflict with the need to limit the amount of bus transportation and increase walkability because the places where people live, we have such a difference in the socioeconomics between different parts of the county. So that's one of the things that we're going to be asking the board to do is tell us which of those criteria listed in the policy are the most important to them. And that will help guide the work of the staff that are going to be developing the proposals.
Okay. And I think that you answered another question with that. Another question was, has the board decided on the list of priorities they will use for the rezoning? And it sounds like it's already in board policy, but the district is looking for more specifics. Is that correct?
That is correct. I believe it's policy 5120, and all of our policies are available on the district website. But I believe it's 7 factors that by policy, the board and the district need to look at. But you can't do all 7. You can't maximize all 7. So we're going to need some direction from the board on which they consider, the highest priorities.
Where do we find that list of 7?
It is policy, I believe it's policy 5120. If you go to our school board page, you'll see a bar along the top, and one of the choices is school board. Click on school board, and then you can see a list of policies, and then there's a way to search policies, and it has them numerically too. And I'm 99% certain it's policy 5120, and that includes the list of the priorities. But I can also email them to Megan as well.
It is
Great, thank you.
5120. I just found my print
Okay.
of it. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It is 7 items. They're listed, but they're not prioritized.
No.
As Jackie said, there's some conflict, which there can be some conflict between the two. So Dr. Edwards, who is leading up the rezoning team, is asking for a prioritization from the board. So financial and administrative efficiency, school capacity and grade level capacity, convenience of access to schools, safe and efficient student transportation and travel, effective and appropriate instruction programs, socioeconomic diversity in school enrollment with consideration of equitable impact on student enrollment at each school, and the utilization of existing school physical facilities. So that's, and in this environment, there's always an eye on the budget and making, the best use of our dollars that seem to become less and less as years go on.
Okay. And I believe you answered this question as well, because it is similar, but it asks about if proximity to a school will be taken into consideration. So I know that came up a lot with the last rezoning. Families would have to drive by 2 schools to get to their school. And it sounds like you're not sure because that's one of those 7 criteria and you're not sure if it will be a priority. Is that correct?
Right.
Okay, got it. Another question that came in, is there a realistic solution that does not include building additional schools on the west side of town? And it sounds like from your presentation, there are no plans to build more schools. Is that correct?
At this point, Suzanne, is that correct?
We're not building new schools. We're in the process of constructing Westwood, and Littlewood has just entered into design. So Littlewood will be, there's going to be buildings on the east side of campus that are older classroom buildings that will be demolished, and the capacity of that school will be increased slightly, but nothing that's going to be a brand new school or additional capacity that I'm aware of. Because like I mentioned, we have rezoning that's happening, then we have a strategic plan that's being developed. And those 2 things together, I think, will lead to the reevaluation of a capital improvement plan, because coupled with that, we've had an extreme escalation in construction costs. So I think we need to look at how are we rearranging our students and what our capacities will be, as well as programs. When we go into a redesign of a school or new construction, we need to know what the capacity and the programs will be. So I think all of that kind of is coming together through the rezoning and the strategic plan.
Okay, and a related question, we got a couple of questions about using the empty buildings, which I know you did address a little bit, Suzanne, so there may not be much more to say about it, but a couple of people wanted to know if there were plans to transition Terwilliger, Prairie View, other ones back to being used so that we could fully take advantage of that.
But at the moment, previously Prairie View that we renovated, the plan was to use Prairie View for a swing school, which we did for Idlewild. So having the swing school at Prairie View and the swing school at Westwood allows us to do construction projects much quicker and without impacting students on an occupied campus. And it actually reduces the cost of the construction because you don't have to phase it. So the original plan for the Prairie View was to do Idlewild and then Williams. So right now that's just kind of on pause. So we're maintaining that school, but we need to get clearer direction on how our capital improvement plan may change. So I think, as I mentioned, that's going to be part of this overall project process of the rezoning, the strategic planning, and coupling with that, the capital improvement plan. Terwilliger is in the process of, I've got a draft Castaldi ready. I have to review to get to our board to approve to submit to DOE. Every single building on that campus would qualify for demolition. So that the use of that school, if it does become revitalized as a school, it would be demolish and reconstruct. It would either be reconstruct at the same capacity or reconstruct at a greater capacity. There's also been talk of maybe moving our transportation facility to that location. So it's a little more centralized. There's been talk about selling the property. There's been a lot of ideas on the table, but there hasn't been anything solid about the use of Old Terwilliger. Will it be revitalized during the this rezoning process? There's no way it can be. It's in very poor condition. So that won't be happening, nor can it be. Those buildings would need to be demolished and new would need to be constructed. And I'm not sure on the plans of Duval. Jackie, do you have any insight on that?
No, not at this point.
Yeah, so I think that's something that the board hasn't decided either. So that's all I know about those 3 facilities at this point.
Okay. Thank you. Next question is, we got quite a few questions about magnet schools, and that came in the chat tonight as well. So a couple of things, are there plans to revamp the magnets at the same time as the rezoning? We've heard rumors that some magnets might move to different schools or might be removed entirely, or admissions criteria might be changed as part of this whole process. If a student is enrolled in a magnet, will they be able to stay at that magnet if they're even after the rezoning? Yeah, that's it. Those are the main magnet questions.
At the community input sessions, the board members, certainly got questions about magnet programs. What I heard most of them say is that they do not plan to make any changes to magnet programs during the rezoning process. What might happen in the future, I can't answer that. That could change. But that's what I heard from a majority of board members, while we were going through the community input process. But can I absolutely guarantee that perhaps a magnet program might not? I mean, we had the board chair did an interview with somebody and said that, there's no absolute guarantee that perhaps a magnet might not be moved. But what we've heard most of them say, and they said this during a workshop too, is that, really, I think we've heard all of them say this, is that they would really like to expand magnets and have more magnets available at more schools. Perhaps have more whole school magnets like we have at Terwilliger, although that's obviously right now at just the kindergarten level, and will be expanded to first grade next year. But they'd like to see more whole school magnets. Perhaps additional magnets at the elementary level, a primary magnet, for example, for IB, but that would be a school-wide magnet as well. So all of those things are being discussed, and I feel very confident that they'll get a lot of significant discussion during the during the strategic planning process.
And I think one other thing that was revealed, I think, through just gathering information about the various magnets is some magnets have infrastructure associated with them that, like the Financial Academy at Buchholz, the agriculture programs that we have at Hawthorne and Santa Fe high schools.
Culinary at Eastside.
Yeah, so there's infrastructure associated with those programs that would make it really very challenging and practically impossible to relocate magnet programs. So I think it was the board, when information was asked, it was an information gathering more than anything, and just gathering information on the programs that we have. And like Jackie said, is there the ability to expand and do magnets better, I guess, that's the gist I got from the board. Jackie, would you agree?
I would agree, and really to make them accessible to more students.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Next question. Are there plans to move entire grade levels from or to schools? For example, changing Alachua Elementary / Irby setup, or moving middle school out of High Springs?
Not that I have heard. Have you heard anything to that effect, Jackie?
Every once in a while that gets discussed in an offhand way at a workshop. One thing I certainly have heard is that a lot of folks want to get 5th grade out of Oakview.
Mhm.
That one it does get a lot of discussion, but otherwise I haven't. In fact, there was a rumor floating around that the school board hates combination schools. I've never ever heard that from the
Mhm.
school board, that they don't like K-8 schools, or they don't like, what Hawthorne has with the 8 through 12. I have never ever heard that. But what I have heard is if possible, let's get 5th grade out of Oakview.
Okay, great. And just a few more questions before we open it up. Thanks for your patience, everyone. Hopefully this is helpful for you. There is a current school board policy that says students will not be rezoned during their last year out of school. So 5th grade, 8th grade, 12th grade. Is that still in place, or are there plans to change that?
I have heard no plans to change that. We've talked about that at the community input sessions. Nobody has ever disagreed with that grandfathering policy, which is that if your child is in the final year, so for example, at Newberry Elementary School, they're in 4th grade, because that's a weird one, they would get to, or they're heading into 4th grade by the time we rezone for 24-25, they would get to stay. So whatever is the final year for that school and the child is heading it, they can stay and finish out at their current school.
Perfect. Okay. And speaking of grandfathering, there was also a question about just grandfathering in all existing students and only rezoning new students. Has that been considered?
That idea has been shared with the board before. It is just not feasible.
Mhm.
It is just absolutely not feasible to do that, because then it's some schools you'd have even more overcrowding than you had before.
Right. Okay. All right. And then moving to some of the questions that came in on chat. That concludes the questions from in advance. We had a question: do vacant schools count against us in the state calculations for capacity? I think we already answered that, Suzanne, when you talked about Terwilliger.
The numbers do count against us at the state level, and the way that they count against us is opening up the opportunity to build capacity with the 1.5 mil money versus the sales tax money. So we can build more capacity with sales tax. We don't have to meet those same state regulations. So until a school is closed or demolished, those spaces do count against us.
Okay. How will a school like Lofton fit into the rezoning plan?
I am not aware that Lofton will change. It's not assigned a geographic area because it has all the special programs there. So I don't believe that's going to be considered in this rezoning. Jackie, are you aware of changing?
Yeah, I'm not aware of any plans to change the way Lofton operates.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. So that concludes the questions we received in advance and in the chat during the presentation, I believe. So now I'll open it up to additional questions. I'm going to go with Jenny Highlander.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. First of all, Jackie and Suzanne, thank you guys so much. I'm sure giving this presentation and answering all these questions is exhausting. I saw you guys at the Santa Fe meeting, and I feel for you because I know that's got to be hard. But thank you. You already answered one of my questions about, so I'm with High Springs, and that the reason I asked that was because I thought the answer was what you said, Jackie, but I think there was just a lot of confusion and misperceptions about that. And it kind of, well, I know where it came from. It came from when Dr. Simon had spoke a couple of times, and I think it was at a High Springs city meeting about having a preference for K through 5, the traditional school setup.
Ooh, oh.
So it has just hung in there, and I'm glad that you kind of, I know there's obviously no absolutes, but at least for now, it seems like you kind of put that to rest.
Yeah.
The only other question I really had, you answered my question about Terwilliger, school choice, like where does that factor in? So kids that are in certain schools because of school choice, who, when they are assigned to that school, there was capacity, and maybe there isn't now, but when they were assigned, there was. and they were, guaranteed through the last year of that school. How do those factor in?
I'm not quite sure I understand the question. I mean, certainly we will be looking at and already looking at the enrollment of each school. We had a workshop not too long ago where our data analytics folks actually put together charts showing where our kids zone versus where they're going, and so there, and it shows kind of the crossing of where kids live, where they're zoned for, where they're actually going. Obviously that changes from year to year. So that's something that the board was interested in seeing. Where are kids going? Where do they come from? Are there any trends there? That kind of thing. So that is certainly part of the data that the district is looking at. And it's something that the board was very interested in, and which is why we had a workshop that primarily covered that topic. Now, vouchers, obviously we all know that vouchers, the state has now expanded that significantly. So we will just have to wait and see what sort of impact that's going to have. We already are aware of one private school that's planning on expanding its capacity. I have to think that's going to happen in the future. How quickly they'll be able to ramp up to accept more students, I don't know. How many families will take advantage of it? Again, I don't know. What we've seen in previous expansions is, and in other states, because we do have experience from other states, is that a lot of the folks who take advantage of vouchers are folks whose kids have never been in a public school anyway. This is simply subsidizing people whose kids were already in private schools. Whether that will continue to be the case, we don't know. But that is something that will have an impact, no doubt about it.
Well, I think one
Jackie,
thing too that I would
Go ahead.
suggest is because there are a lot of nuances to the children that are part of open enrollment, and I know I've heard Kim Neal speak to it, but I wouldn't want to relay misinformation. I would suggest reaching out to Kim Neal, because she would be able to tell you, she's talked about that before.
Okay.
She would be able to tell you the way the district handles that.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
that question actually came up during the previous rezoning that didn't complete. And the answer was that everything would be reset after the rezoning. So all of the open enrollment would be reset. You wouldn't have that zoning exception anymore. So I don't know if that's still the case. Maybe Kim's the right person to ask, but that's the answer that she gave last time.
Yeah, I don't know if Kim would be able to answer that now, because ultimately everything's up to the school board.
Yeah.
Okay. Next, Mary.
Hi, Jackie and Suzanne, thank you. I think actually all of my questions were covered, but I did notice for the email where parents and community members can submit input, the rezoning at
Yes.
GM. You mentioned that the school board members will be getting that. And I'm just wondering how they're going to be getting it, because I imagine that a lot of times people share stuff both to the Mass school board member email and it might be overload. So maybe clarify that if this is actually going to them, the rezoning, maybe you don't need to also send it to each of them.
That is correct. I mean, we worked with the school board to set up so that they actually have access to this particular box, so that they can go in at any time and real time see the input as it comes in. So you're correct. Folks do not need to do both.
But what I'm hearing is they can do it, but we don't know that they're going to go look.
Yeah, they certainly can do it both ways, either way, whichever they prefer.
Okay.
Yeah. And
Thanks.
that other email, the one that goes to the board members, all one email address is boardmembers@gm.sbac.edu, board members being all one word.
Yeah. Okay. I just wanted to clarify that because there was even confusion, I know, for some board members about reading their own emails through
Yeah.
that
Well, and of
original one.
course-
So I know that people are new, but I just want to make sure that this information that we're sharing actually gets to the board members.
And people also send individual board members, because they all have their own individual email addresses. The advantage of this one is it also goes directly to the staff that are working on the rezoning plan.
Right. And then my only other question, you sort of answered, it's about the proximity. Is there a distance from school that is absolutely protected? You know, so I live a quarter of a mile from school or a half a mile from school. Is there anything that's pretty much protected right now? Or is anything on the table?
Well, I think that's something that the board is going to need to prioritize. One thing that we have done is map the sidewalk infrastructure for not as a crow flies, but actual sidewalk infrastructure in GIS. And the zone where we are not required to provide busing is 2 miles from a school. So if we and some of the walking zones overlap for some of the schools that are, closer to each other. And so if we start moving children from those walking zones, moving them to another school that wouldn't be in that school's walking zone, then we're going to be increasing our need for transportation. So that's where the board's prioritization of those items outlined in that policy come into play. So there is nothing set in stone that says we shall not move students from these walking zones. That will be determined by the board. Does that make sense?
It does. This may be, in watching the board members discuss this, it's almost like this is not what they do, right? The professionals, that do that, it almost sounds like they're almost not equipped to prioritize. Are they going to be getting guidance as far as how to prioritize? In terms of that balance of money and transportation and proximity, do they have everything they need to make those decisions right now? Or will, someone from, I can't remember the firm.
A DRMP?
Will someone, give them some guidance? Because I just don't, this is really confusing to me. This isn't what, I don't do this for a living. Some of you might. Maybe Gina Master de Casa gets it, but this is so complex, and I see them asking the board members for a list and wondering how in the world do they come up with a list?
Yeah, there are a lot of moving parts, no question about it, and one of the ways that's been addressed in the past and in other districts that have tackled rezoning. I mean, right now I think it's Hillsborough. Is by providing the board with more than one proposal. Now, whether or not the board, so the board will have to tell us, do you want more than one proposal that stresses certain criteria, that prioritizes certain criteria over other criteria? And then do we then tweak those things? So that is a possible way of handling that, where you have a couple of options, and then provide information on, okay, what impact does that have on the transportation, on walkability, on socioeconomics, so on and so forth. So that is certainly a possibility. And you're right, for a couple of board members, this is not their first rodeo. They went through this before, but for other board members, they may have seen it on the outside as activists or involved parents or whatever. but they weren't on the board the last time we kind of went through this. And it's more recent than a lot of people realize, because we did go through this process when we were opening Terwilliger. We just didn't end up using any of the proposals that were brought forward. But so
Okay,
yeah.
that's really helpful, because so basically they lend their expertise by potentially offering multiple plans and choices to the board that
Yes,
way.
But
Okay.
again, there are so many ways you could rezone the district. I mean, that's just that this, a million ways you could skin this particular cat. And the staff does feel strongly that they do need at least some overarching guidance on, which of those priorities are absolutely most important to the board as a collective.
Mhm.
So that at least you can narrow it down a little bit.
All right.
Thank you.
And I have a question, and then I'll move to Dorothy. So the biggest concern that I hear from people over the county is transportation. So, and I know you addressed that sort of. The other concern that I hear from a lot of people is about programs. So for example, if their child is in an ESE program and then another school that might be rezoned for doesn't have an ESE program or doesn't have as strong of one, or ESOL, or gifted, or sports, or extracurricular. Some high schools are the only ones that have that sport, like lacrosse is not at every school, for example. Is there anything that's going to be considered for that to kind of equal the playing field, if you will, so that students won't have to lose those really critical components of school?
Well, I mean, quite frankly, that's the situation you have now. Where certain programs are not offered in all schools. Now, for things like ESOL and ESE, we obviously provide transportation to special programs if, for example, a family wants to take advantage of one of the ESOL programs at the center schools, but a lot of families opt out of that and want to go to their zone school. So that does exist, and we certainly have families who say, I want to go to such and such a school because they have a lacrosse program, or because I think my kid would like to be in this baseball program as opposed to another baseball program. Well, we're getting into a weird area there. That's not really a reason to grant a kid a zoning exemption. So it's a situation we're already dealing with now.
Well, no, I think it's more that they're established in the program. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
if they're in a sports program and they get zoned for a school that doesn't even have that and they're already established, and I think that's more what it's about. It's not that this is better than that one or anything like that.
But yeah, I completely understand, and I firmly believe that will be part of the discussion, both through rezoning and through strategic planning.
Okay. I believe Dorothy was next.
You're muted, Dorothy.
Sorry, I lowered my hand and I forgot to unmute. Too many things to click. This is more a process question than a substance question. One of the biggest criticisms I heard when we were going through the process with Terwilliger was that there was tons and tons and tons of time. Well, not tons, but there was time for input, leading up to the process. And then the maps got unveiled and there was some input on those, but then at the last minute, Plan F or whatever it ended up being, that last plan, which ended up being the final plan, was unveiled, and there was very little time for input on what ended up being the final plan. So, and I mean, I know that we could go on with this for 3,000 years, and people still wouldn't feel like they had enough input. So I'm sensitive to that. But, once kind of the unveiling on August 16th happens, and, it kind of gets narrowed down to a couple of options, or it gets tweaked a little bit or whatever, will there be, I feel like it always comes down to the end and there's a rush. Once the final plan is kind of set, will there be time to get input on that? Or do you know how that will work?
Well, again, I go back to the calendar that I shared earlier. So yes, there is time between the first reading, which is where you essentially present the candidate that most everybody feel, or that at least most everybody, meaning on the board, feels is the one that they want to go with the opportunity, but for some tweaking after that. How much tweaking? I don't know. The problem is we are dealing with, once you have that first reading, the clock has started based on the state's rules for what you have to do to get that policy, to get that new policy in place. And it can't take too long. So for example, if we don't get this thing passed by, it's a date in early to mid-December, you have to start the process all over again, which would be, of course, a significant problem, because then you're running up against the magnet application process, even the process of determining how many teachers each school needs. And there's just a whole lot of things that have to happen. So we are up against a state schedule that we have to follow to come up with to finalize new zone lines. So that's why we've set 2 months in between the proposal first going to the board, or proposals first going to the board, and when we have that first reading, and then the following 2 months for until the board actually makes a decision. So that's just the reality that we have to deal with, is there is a state mandated timeline that we have to follow. And if you miss those dates, you got to start all over again.
Right, but I guess, so last time, the one that ended up being the final wasn't even in existence at the time that the first reading happened. And so I don't know if you remember, but they started with 3, and then at the 11th hour, a completely different plan came into place, and it was voted on almost immediately. That very last iteration, I think it was called Plan F. I can't remember which letter was what.
And are you talking about the one that just basically moved everybody from old Terwilliger to new Terwilliger?
Yes.
Yeah, that was
The plan that was brought up at a meeting by the board. That was something that wasn't even, I mean, we went through, that was like an 8-month process we went through to come up with the rezoning and all of those options, and narrowing the options and getting input. And that was something that literally staff was unaware of, and that it came up at a board meeting. And
Right, and I believe they voted on it that same meeting. And so it felt very sneaky to a lot of people. It felt very unfair, because it got brought up, and then it was voted on, and then it was the rule. And so obviously this is going to be different with something like this. So I'm wondering, like, is there any protection to put in place that something like that doesn't happen again, where it's just on the fly, or is that just up to the board and they do what they do and there's no rule against that?
that it is up to the board. I
Yeah.
mean, there is no question that is up to the board. Now, that was an unusual situation, because we'd gone through the whole process, and then as we got to the end of the process, we then had a new superintendent.
Mhm.
And that was a dramatic change right at the tail end of the whole process. So yeah, that was very unusual, and it took most of us by surprise. Certainly took me by surprise.
Yeah.
But it's in the hands of the board.
I mean, to the extent feedback can be offered, I think that was I would prefer that it not happen like that again, because I think a lot of the people that had given all that input and showed up to all those meetings felt very marginalized by the way that it was done at the very last minute. So to the extent that you can give the board feedback, that's one bit of feedback I would definitely encourage you to give them.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Dorothy. All right. Any more questions? We've talked about a lot, and I really appreciate Jackie and Suzanne's time, especially in the evening, the day before the last day of school. I'm sure there's a million things going on right now, but we have gotten a lot of information. I've typed down your answers, and of course this is being recorded so we can share with others who weren't able to be here.